Paris in the 1920s was a city that liked to give the impression it never slept, though in reality many of its residents were quite exhausted by the events of the previous decade. The First World War had left behind a generation looking for distraction, escape, and any kind of novelty to distance the mind from memories that lingered. In that atmosphere, many people found themselves turning towards substances that promised relief without requiring effort. Among these substances was heroin, which at the time still carried an air of scientific respectability, because it was originally promoted by a major German pharmaceutical company as a non-addictive alternative to morphine. People in Paris did not think of it as a street drug or something sinister, but rather as something modern, efficient, and in certain circles, fashionable. It found a home in the city that was already famous for indulgence and experimentation, quietly weaving itself into nightlife, art studios, small apartments, and medical practices. Heroin entered daily life almost casually. Pharmacists could stock it without fear of legal trouble, and doctors offered it for ailments ranging from coughs to anxiety. Patients found that it helped them sleep, and many appreciated the sense of calm it brought. Things that once felt overwhelming could temporarily dissolve under its effects. Meanwhile, supply chains were convenient and inexpensive. Even as France tried to rebuild from war, commerce flowed easily through the ports of Marseille, where illicit shipments eventually mingled with legitimate medical supplies. The line between legal and illegal was not firm. People joked that the drug was simply too convenient to dislike and too effective to worry about. Many artists and writers of the time became associated with the substance. This was not because they were necessarily trying to be rebellious, but because drugs were simply part of the scenery in the cafes and rented studios where they gathered. It was easy to encounter poets scribbling half-formed verses while feeling weightless, or painters smoking and laughing while someone prepared a dose nearby. To them, heroin felt like inspiration, or at least a pause from creative frustration. It offered a soft fog through which ideas could drift without judgment. The city's bohemian enclaves welcomed these altered states as signs of authenticity. If someone wanted to appear worldly or deep, mentioning a new experience with an imported substance could spark conversation long into the night, until the horizon began to lighten again. The social circles in which heroin thrived included foreigners drawn to Paris by the promise of freedom. Americans who disliked prohibition back home found a refuge in Montparnasse, where no bartender would scold them and no law truly interfered with their evenings. The mingling of expatriates with locals created a shared curiosity about unfamiliar pleasures, including drugs that were barely understood. Some visitors brought substances with them, while others learned about new ones from acquaintances in smoky bars. Heroin was often presented as something refined compared to the cruder options that left people stumbling. Its use at times resembled ritual, with syringes and needles treated almost like precision tools for self-improvement. No matter how inaccurate that belief was, doctors remained important in shaping public attitudes. Many sincerely believed heroin was a medical breakthrough, based on the assurances provided to them through trusted professionals and respected journals. They wrote prescriptions with the intention of helping patients. Some physicians even took the drug themselves, both to understand its effects, and because they were susceptible to the same stresses as their patients. The medical community did not fully comprehend dependency yet. When patients returned asking for more, it seemed logical to assume that their symptoms were returning rather than that the treatment was causing harm. Pharmacies continued to profit, and the myth of harmless relief continued to spread. In some neighborhoods, heroin use became so typical that it influenced the rhythm of daily life. Cafes with loyal regulars would notice customers relaxing for unusually long periods, sipping slowly and drifting into daydreams. Landlords might hear little from tenants for days at a time, concluding that isolation was simply part of the artistic temperament. Conversations between acquaintances sometimes revolved around whether one should increase or decrease a dose, depending on mood. It was not glamorous in most cases, just ordinary, like coffee or cigarettes, but this familiarity made its growth difficult to notice until it had already become widespread. Despite the early appeal, small indications of trouble began to surface. Some individuals who once appeared charming and lively grew withdrawn and unreliable. They might forget engagements, lose interest in creative projects, or show up asking to borrow money because their supply had run out earlier than planned. Families worried, but often felt unsure how to intervene, since few understood that dependence was forming. Newspapers occasionally reported incidents involving sudden illness, theft, or other strange behavior, but readers treated these stories as curiosities rather than warnings. The general belief persisted that heroin was under control, just another indulgence of a modern city. As the decade progressed, the darker aspects of the trade gradually emerged. International smugglers used the busy French ports for operations, helping push low-priced supplies into Paris. Criminal networks grew confident, knowing that local authorities were slow to recognize the threat. Some groups developed their own spheres of influence over nightlife districts, offering drugs alongside gambling, alcohol, or companionship. It became possible to see that the drug market was slowly shifting from a quiet medical accessory toward something more secretive, driven by profit rather than care. The sense of freedom that once felt harmless developed subtle shadows. The city government eventually faced pressure to respond. Public officials received complaints from police officers who noticed patterns among arrests. Judges saw repeat offenders who had once been respectable. Hospitals recorded cases of patients who experienced unexpected declines after extended use. Bit by bit, the idea that heroin might not be safe gained ground. International agreements were formed to control certain substances, and by the end of the 1920s, heroin was no longer as easily obtained through legitimate means. Doctors grew more cautious. Pharmacists required more documentation. The public discussion shifted from curiosity to concern, though the shift was gradual and met with resistance from people who had come to rely on the drug. By the early 1930s, the once casual presence of heroin began to shrink, but its influence did not disappear. Some individuals who had grown dependent struggled with withdrawal, with few resources or understanding available to help them. Illegal suppliers filled the gaps left by tightening laws, ensuring that addiction remained a problem, even after society acknowledged the dangers. The drug no longer carried the respectable image it once did, and what had briefly seemed sophisticated began to feel like a trap. The image of the romantic artist with a syringe lost its charm, and moralists used the shift as evidence that indulgence always leads to ruin. The laughter in late-night cafes grew a little more cautious, replaced at times by a quieter mood. Looking back, the heroin craze in Paris during the 1920s reads as a story of misplaced optimism. People wanted relief after war and trauma, and they believed science had delivered it. They trusted new products without enough skepticism because hope clouded judgment. They assumed that modernity would only bring improvements to life and that any new remedy must be superior to the old. The city's energy and creativity magnified the trend, turning what might have been a small medical issue into a widespread social experiment. Only when consequences became too obvious to ignore did attitudes change. Even then, the shift did not erase the experiences of those who had been affected. Though it might feel distant now, the era offers a reminder that societies often fail to see dangers in things that promise convenience and comfort. Heroin in 1920s Paris was not initially a symbol of rebellion or decay. It was simply something that made tired people feel better in a world that felt unpredictable. The longing for escape, whether emotional or physical, made them vulnerable to something they did not fully understand. And while the city continued to celebrate beauty and ambition on the surface, many residents quietly wrestled with dependence behind closed doors. In the end, Paris moved on to new trends and distractions, and the memory of that particular phase faded into the broader story of the Roaring Twenties. But for a time, the drug blended into the heartbeat of the city. In quiet apartments, where someone hoped for a moment of peace, in dim cafes where artists imagined brilliance while drifting through haze, and in medical offices where well-intentioned professionals thought they had found a miracle. It was a brief period when heroin seemed to promise more than it delivered, and the lesson of that misunderstanding lingered long after the party ended.